there's generally an increased recognition that the energy generation space is not necessarily should not necessarily solely be the responsibility of the public sector. And so we're seeing the private sector becoming increasingly involved in the generation landscape. For that requires a very strict discipline and a lot of political will to try and create the necessary investment frameworks for the private sector to participate. We've seen in South Africa through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. We've seen it in Ghana with the realization of the SemPower transaction. We've seen it in Azura, in Nigeria with the Azura power plant. Kenya in East Africa has been doing it for some time with their thermal power projects and more recently in the geothermal space. So we're definitely seeing the market open up and encouragingly also the participation of African institutions in some of these projects. You touch on an interesting point because while infrastructure development, project finance, these are disciplines which have very established fundamentals, very true rules of engagement, if you call it that, no matter where in the world you're doing them. But I think you need to recognize that on the African continent and within the countries on the continent, there are very specific nuances. Community engagement is an important one. Land issues, access to land, those are all sensitive issues that need to be carefully managed. Interestingly, the more successful projects that we've seen on the continent are not international developers coming in, constructing the plant and leaving. There's a deep investment into the jurisdictions where they're doing business. There's good engagement with local communities, and there's involvement of local enterprise in those projects, because ultimately that's what makes these initiatives sustainable. Any infrastructure asset in development it's not something that it requires a 1 or 2 year outlook. These are very long-term investments, and relationships above any legal agreements are key if any of them to be successful. It's absolutely received great international acclaim for what it's achieved, and in a relatively short space of time. It's also been very successful in mushrooming an industry around itself in South Africa, whereas where the program kicked off 5 or 6 years ago, we were doing there were public-private partnership programs on the go, but there wasn't a flow of transactions as we've seen coming out of the Renewable Energy REIPPP program. In South Africa, we now have sophisticated market investors, we have financial institutions that are involved, we have legal expertise, we have local manufacturing capabilities. So you've really seen this industry grow around the renewable energy program. Elsewhere in Africa, I think they've looked at the program, they've seen its benefits, and I think certainly they've adopted some of its learnings. But having said that, each jurisdiction is unique, and you would never take the investment framework from South Africa and try and replicate that as a carbon copy elsewhere. But certainly some of those learnings would be adopted in other jurisdictions. Because we are lending very long-term funds for infrastructure assets. In South Africa, 18-year debt funding is not unusual for some of the projects. And because of the benefit that leverage has in a project, the longer the funding that can be made available for the project, ultimately the lower the tariff that can be offered to the end consumer. So there is a lot of emphasis coming from the governing bodies, also from the developers themselves, to try and attract the longest term financing possible. To take a view on the creditworthiness of a state for a long period of time is something that is quite difficult. In South Africa, we're a fully fledged banking operation. In South Africa, we are South African. We believe in the South African story. We have a support coming from National Treasury for at least some of Eskom's obligations under their offtake agreements with the private sector. So those are some of the fundamentals that help us deliver long-term financing. As you move into jurisdictions where perhaps there's the credit rating of the state entities is not as strong as South Africa's, you do see the tenors come off a little bit, but what helps us is that we then look towards multilateral organizations. The World Bank has a number of arms that are involved in coming into country, trying to help structure certain risk mitigation tools that move the risk directly away from the sovereign alone to the World Bank's balance sheet, for instance. And obviously, as a very highly rated entity, that provides a financing institution with a lot of comfort. So while you may not necessarily be able to take a view purely and entirely on a sovereign, there are very sophisticated mechanisms to try and find your credit comfort elsewhere.